I could rip off your tits with my teeth.
Oscar Isaac really carried the whole show. So Moon Knight recently had its finale, and it was something. This is the first MCU show that I actually finished, and was really the only one that I was actually looking forward to. I reviewed the series premiere, and I liked it. I thought it was good. Had a lot of intrigue and mystery, and had the potential to be great, but it really just turned out to be meh. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Now, I think Moon Knight is an interesting character, but I'm not an expert, but I do know a little bit. So I really wouldn't label myself as a big fan, but I know someone who is a fan of Moon Knight, and knows more about him than me, my heterosexual life partner. So this is how I plan on doing this review. The first part will be my thoughts on the series as a casual viewer, discussing what I liked and didn't like, etc. And the second part will be my friend's thoughts on the series, as a fan of the character, and his thoughts and opinions on it, just like my Mortal Kombat video. I'll leave some timestamps down below for each section. So without further ado, here are my thoughts on the series. Also, some spoilers ahead.
Get off that nigga dick, bro. What is you doing?
Now, I assume you've already seen this show, but I'll give you a brief summary. So there's a guy named Stephen Grant, and he's kind of a mess. He sleepwalks, he's always exhausted, he wakes up beaten up and in random places. Then one day he finds out that he's been living a double life as a guy named Mark Spector, who's an ex-mercenary, but now is the avatar for the Egyptian god Khonshu. And he beats up criminals on Khonshu's behalf as his warrior, Moon Knight. So two personalities occupy this one body. Then it's revealed that a man named Arthur Harrow plans to free an imprisoned Egyptian god by the name of Ammit, and unleash her upon the world to judge the people of Earth. So Stephen, Mark, and his ex-wife Layla must stop him. I would say that's about the gist of it. Starting off the positive, the biggest standout is Oscar Isaac as Stephen Grant and Mark Spector. Since he's playing two different characters, I was curious how he was going to pull that off, and he did great. Easily the best part, which is good because he's the lead, you know? Stephen and Mark feel like two separate people, with their own mannerisms and dialect. Mark is stern and serious and no nonsense, while Stephen is meek, shy, good-natured, and basically the opposite of Mark. And my personal favorite aspect of the show was seeing Stephen find out who he really is, and his relationship and connection to Mark. Episode 5 in the psych ward is probably my favorite, because of the amount of information and character development we get for both Mark and Stephen. And like I said in the very beginning, he really carried the whole show, because almost everything else isn't nearly as interesting or well done. But again, I'm getting ahead of myself, so we'll get there. Some more positives. I think Layla and Arthur were pretty serviceable. This isn't my favorite role of Ethan Hawke's, but I guess he was fine. Same with Layla. They were both serviceable, and I didn't hate any of them. Didn't find them unbearable or annoying, so that's a positive, or at least I like to think so. And the last thing I'll touch on in this section is the filmmaking aspect. When it comes to the cinematography and stuff like that, I think it starts out pretty strong in the first two episodes, but then slowly takes a dip, and then it picks back up again towards the end. There are some really great shots and moments, and really creative uses of the camera with its transitions, but in some episodes, or in the majority of some episodes, the creativity kind of stops, and it just feels more standard. The first two episodes and the last two episodes are probably the most creative and interesting ones. So yeah, those would be all the positives I really have to say. The rest is going to be negative, but it's really more so just disappointment, because after the credits rolled on the finale, I was left underwhelmed and a little disappointed.
You went full retard, man.
Okay, so I mentioned how good Oscar Isaac was, and that he carried the whole show. And honestly, he was the reason I kept watching, because the actual main conflict and story isn't that good. And then by the end, I felt dissatisfied with the conclusion. Now, I thought it started off well enough. The first two episodes created enough intrigue that I was curious to see where the story will actually go. But with each episode, I felt the main conflict and story lost steam, and became more interesting as the show went. Arthur unleashing Ammit didn't really seem that compelling anymore. And when he finally does, and the big battle happens, it was pretty underwhelming, and was actually resolved pretty quickly. Moon Knight and Layla fought Arthur, and it was supposed to feel like a spectacle, but it really didn't. Khonshu and Ammit had a fight, and I never thought that I would be bored watching a kaiju fight, but they found a way. So to me, the story starts off pretty well, but then quickly loses steam, then everything happens and gets wrapped up in the final episode. So the ending just felt very lackluster. Eventually, I ended up just watching because of Oscar Isaac's performance, and the mystery and relationship between Stephen and Mark. That was way more interesting than whatever the hell was happening in the main conflict. That for me is the biggest weakness that the show has. Yeah, Oscar Isaac was great. I really enjoyed watching him. I just wish the show he was in had a much better plot. Now I want to talk about the action, because it was something that I was really looking forward to. Moon Knight can be very violent, and I was curious to see if they're really going to push the boundaries and really let him go loose. In the first episode, we see Stephen black out in the middle of fights, and then when he comes to, there are bloody bodies everywhere. So I was excited to actually see Mark as Moon Knight and really let him go loose. But unfortunately, he never really does. There are a few cool fight scenes, sure, but nothing really felt brutal or as violent as I was hoping, and definitely not as violent as they were hinting at. I know some people will say that I shouldn't have had those expectations because this is an MCU show, and more importantly, this is Disney. But there's a quote from Kevin Feige speaking about how violent and brutal the show was, and how they were going to show all of it. So they gave me the expectations, and I think that they failed to deliver.
So that was a fucking lie.
The last thing I'll mention is the CGI. I've seen a lot of people pick apart and complain about it, and yeah, the quality definitely varies, but honestly there are only a few times where the CGI truly looked bad. And there are some spotty moments here and there, but it was okay overall. Although on the flip side, there were times where it did look great. Honestly, aside from a few times, it never really took me out of the experience. I guess because I hampered my expectations in that department because it is a TV series and not a movie. So I kinda knew it wasn't gonna look as good as the movies.
Men are better than women.
And that's about all I really have to say. It had a great setup and a good first 2 episodes, but the story lost steam and had a lackluster conclusion, and was really just carried by Oscar Isaac's performance. If it was anyone else in this role, I don't think they could have pulled it off, and I don't think I would have actually finished it. Overall, it was just meh. I've seen people say that this is the best Disney Plus show, and if that's true, then I'm sorry. Then I'm even less interested in finishing the MCU shows than I already was. I think some people might say that I'm being a little too harsh, but I was genuinely excited. I was digging the first couple episodes, I thought it had a lot of potential, and I thought the story was interesting enough, but then it quickly lost steam and came to a meh conclusion, which according to some people online is actually a trend with these MCU shows. But anyway, that's just my opinion. So now I want to pass the torch over to my heterosexual life partner so that he can give his thoughts on the series as a fan.
Cause I'm gonna grape you in the mouth!
So yeah, I watched The Moon's Kite, and after thinking to myself for a while, I came to the conclusion that this isn't Moon Knight. Now hear me out before you decide to stretch my balls out to my anus, but I thought the show had a lot of potential after watching the first episode, but as the show went on, I slowly started to become less and less invested in it. I'm gonna start with the main plot that involves the Egyptian mythos. This is something that the comics never really dived into, outside of Khonshu, or at least to my knowledge, so I was actually down for it when I saw that was the direction that they were taking it, and I felt that it was a big risk trying to do it this way. But once the gears started turning in my tiny pea-sized brain, I realized that this kind of ruins the character of Khonshu. Throughout most of the Moon Knight iterations, you never truly knew if the voice in Mark's head was actually Khonshu, or just another personality manifesting itself into Mark's subconscious. This gave the character of Mark Spector a lot more layers, and made him seem like he was listening to the voices in his head, rather than the actual god of the moon. And even though in one of the more recent runs, they have flat out stated it was actually Khonshu, I still think that it was a bad idea because it makes the whole mental aspect of Mark's mind less interesting. Plus, by the end of the day, Moon Knight is a crime fighter, so it would have been cool to see him in a city actually fighting crime like he normally does. Despite the stigma that most normies give Moon Knight as just being a white Batman, I would have honestly preferred that over the Egyptian stuff that we got. And to all the people that call Moon Knight a white Batman, well, the joke's on you because Batman's actually a white guy. Ha! Get wrecked, retards.
Never go full retard.
Speaking of flats, I found the fights in this show to be very underwhelming. As stated by the piece of shit before me, it's not as brutal as it was made out to be, and for a lot of the time, you only get to see the aftermath of the carnage rather than actually seeing the fights happen. This hinders the end fight scene especially, because instead of seeing Moon Knight overcome Arthur, well, we instead just get to skip to the end of the fight. I know this was to set up that admittedly sweet end credits scene with Jake Lockley, but I still felt that it was a cop-out not being able to see how the fight scene ended. The overall fight scenes just felt like basic superhero fight scenes, when they should feel more like Raid fight scenes, you know? As a matter of fact, there is a Moon Knight comic that is just like the Raid, in Moon Knight from the Dead. When you compare stuff that he does in the show to some of the real fucked up shit he does in the comics, like ripping off someone's face and wearing it just feels watered down. Going back to Lockley, at first I really did like the twist at the end credits scene, but then I started thinking, did Jake Lockley just murder a bunch of innocent people just to get to Arthur? As far as to my knowledge, this was just another regular mental institute, yet we see a bunch of nurses and staff laying on the ground dead. I thought Khonshu only punishes evil people, yet as far as we know, all that personnel was innocent, so what the fuck is up with that?
Because.
Also, it seems as though they're trying to make Jake out to seem like an assassin in this iteration, when he is normally just a gruff and tough cabbie driver to get info on the streets. I mean, sure, he can hold his own in a fight, but he wasn't going out of his way to murder people. Another thing that I liked at first, but then bugged me later on, was the costumes. Don't get me wrong, I actually do like the designs, and I think that the Moon Knight costume, having wraps like a mummy has wraps, was actually really rad, sticking to the Egyptian theme. But this just goes back on what I said about Khonshu, and about how it's obvious that he's a separate entity and not a manifestation of Mark's mind. Another thing that bugged me was the use of Mr. Knight. In the comics, he has such a significant role in the character of Mark Spector and represents Mark's mental health during that time. But here, he's watered down to kind of a joke, and it doesn't really represent just how interesting he is in terms of Mark's alter egos. Not that you'll see much of it, or the original Moon Knight's costume for that matter. One of the biggest things that hurts the show for me is the fact that we only get to see the actual Moon Knight character 25% of the time throughout the whole show. To me, Oscar Isaac did great, but that's just the problem. It feels more like the Oscar Isaac show rather rather than the Moon Knight show. The only episode I can really find this excusable is episode 5, and that's because it had some really great development for the characters of Mark and Steven. Honestly, I would rather watch Daredevil Season 3, where Double D didn't even wear the main costume for the whole season. Ultimately, I didn't like it. I think that it is a fun show for people who don't know much about the character of Moon Knight, but as a fan, it feels more like a disappointing portrayal of the character. I do applaud them for at least trying to do something different with the Moon Man and taking a risk, but to me, this just didn't feel like Moon Knight. Sorry, but not sorry. Suck it!
Every time you bust a nut, you are depriving a life.
But yeah, that's really all I gotta say about Moon Knight. Parts of it were very good, had a nice strong start, but by the end I found it pretty anticlimactic and just okay overall. And that's just my opinion as a casual viewer who knows like the basics about the character. And of course my friend who does know more about the character isn't too fond of this adaptation. And of course, as always, I asked you guys, what did you think of the show? I'm seeing several people that are on the same page as me just saying that it's alright, it's okay, or just meh. But then I see other people say that it's possibly the best MCU Disney show. And like I said earlier in this video, if that is actually true, then I'm even less interested in finishing the other MCU shows. I watched a few episodes of each show so far, and I'm really not that impressed. Being honest, I might not even finish them. But anyway, that's gonna do for the video. Hope you enjoyed. If you did, go and drop a like on it. Or if you didn't like the video, leave a dislike on it. And leave a comment, let me know what you think about Moon Knight. Did you like it? Did you hate it? Leave a comment, let me know. Thanks for watching. I'll catch you next time.
He's pulling his cock out.
Okay, boys. Let's dance.
Oh my God.